Hey, welcome to the podcast. You're getting ready to hear an extremely unfiltered conversation about Christians and government, Jesus and politics between two friends and pastors, me and Pastor Josh McPherson of Grace City Church up in Wenatchee, Washington. There may be some things that when you listen to this, you disagree. That's okay. We can disagree without disrespect. But I just have a deep conviction that if the church won't disciple people, the world will, and that we need to step into conversations, not abdicate out of them. So, welcome to the podcast. Enjoy. All right, welcome everybody. I'm here with Pastor Bishop Josh McPherson, the pastor of Preach. I don't know, I was going to keep going, but I don't have anything. So if you're just joining in, here's what's happened. We're going to spend the next few minutes talking about Christians in government / Christians in politics. Here's why. Josh, by the way, welcome.
Thank you, Josh. Great to join you.
It's going to be awesome. We're going to do this for a couple reasons. First of all, Pastor Josh is a close friend of mine. I love and trust this man. Too, Josh, when you came to Lake Point, our people immediately just embraced you like an extended family member. I'm pretty sure they like you more than me. And so it
was a really enjoyable time. Met a lot of, honestly, incredible people. I had my son with me and he's like, Dad, it feels like home. So it was really fun to be down there.
Well, that blesses us because you were a blessing to us. Yeah. Well, let me hop in, man.
It was an honor.
We obviously, right now, I think as I'm sitting here right now, we're 40, 50 days away from a presidential election. I think 39. Christians right now, they're at, how many?
39.
39, okay. Christians right now, they're asking an enormous number of questions about Christians and government, Christians and politics. The reason I want to talk to you about this is one, because you're fun, hilarious, and awesome, and two, because you have you spent many years in law enforcement, so you've worked at the relationship of the civic level. Two, I know you to be a student of both American history and American civics. Three, you're just a thoughtful, intelligent person, and as a member, as a citizen of the People's Republic of Washington, as you have referred to it, you have had some dust-ups at the intersection of church and state. So let me just start right here. Josh, let's go right at it. Your church broke the law on purpose and ended up suing the government. So let's just start right there and give us the quick postage stamp of that. And then I'm going to ask you why that wasn't a sin. Go.
Well, I don't know if there's a quick postage stamp, but it was during COVID, and essentially our governor put us into a state of emergency, and which meant all civil magistrate control centralized on the gubernatorial office of the governor. So no more city council, no more local school board, no more commissioners. They don't get to make any decisions for us, the ones that we've elected. It was essentially one guy in Olympia making all the decisions for everyone in Washington. Generally speaking, when power and authority is centralized, that's a bad thing. We see that happen in tyranny. So anarchy is the decentralization of all power. Tyranny is the centralization of power in a few. We live in, thankfully, a constitutional republic, which is where power and authority is valued, but it's separated so it can be wielded and controlled. So because of our theology that says man is sinful, we believe man should be governed. But because we believe man is sinful, we believe governments should be constrained. And so we live in this constitutional republic where we have self-constraints built in, which is incredible. Those got annihilated during COVID in the name of this emergency powers. The intention for those emergency powers was that for, a tsunami hits and the government needs to make split-second decisions, statewide to save people's lives and it's imminent threat. Okay, great. And then those powers recede over the course of 3 or 4 days. He instituted those executive powers, we believe, illegally because there was no way to define the emergency, so we couldn't know when we were out of it. And so we got into this state of emergency, and then we were there for over 18 months. Over 3,000 edicts and new quote-unquote laws were issued from press releases by our governor every Friday. It was changing how people could do business and go about their daily lives, which basically turned Washington from a first world country into a third world country, because the reasons that businesses don't buy property and build businesses in third world countries is because there's no sustained rule of law. There's no consistency. So there's great social instability, great economic instability, educational instability, kids weren't in school, so on and so forth. So as this was going on, that's kind of context for what we're trying to do as a church. Our first response was to believe the best. We're here as a friend of the government, not enemy of the government. What can we do to help? Whatever they say we should do, we're going to be the best citizens possible. And then, 6-7 weeks into this, you're like, man, the government, the hospital isn't overrun. No one's dying that we know of. This is crazy. And you start kind of being a little more suspicious of what they're saying. And then you get 2 or 3 months in, you're like, this is insane. Abortion clinics were open. You could buy alcohol at the alcohol shop. And BLM was allowed to march maskless down the streets, shouting and screaming and being hailed as heroes by our governor, but it was illegal to meet as a church or sing. And
Strip
so
clubs,
that's when we were
Seahawks
like,
games.
Strict clubs, Seahawks games, abortion clinics, and that's when my kids came to me and said, Dad, is it true you can get an abortion, but you can't go to church? And I said, yeah. They said, what are we going to do about it? And I said, well, we got to figure that out. So we went through the normal channels. We wrote letters to our commissioners. I actually put together a coalition of commissioners, elected officials locally. We wrote letters as elected officials to the governor. I wrote a letter signed by over 40 pastors saying, hey, we're going to be responsible. We can be trusted to care for ourselves. We know that what's happening on the ground here. You can trust us. Sent that, denied, ignored, not responded to. And so then we told them what we're going to do. We're acting responsibly. We're not scofflaws. We believe you're breaking the law, not us, and we're going to use the means available to us to get you to act lawfully. Because that's our calling as citizens. We're called to consent to government rule when it aligns with biblical principles. When it steps outside of the moral, natural law of God, and it steps outside of the constraints that God has put on government very clearly in His Word, it's the responsibility of the people, but I would say more specifically the church, to speak up and say, no, you're out of your lane, and it's going to hurt a lot of people. So that's what we did. We sued the governor, and we weren't suing him because of discrimination. We were suing him to break the hold of emergency powers that were preventing our local authorities from doing the job we'd elected them for. So we were simply fighting for our local officials to do the job we elected them for. And that's why we sued them. And then in concert, we reopened our church that was quote unquote against the law. I would argue it wasn't civil disobedience because we weren't breaking any laws. We were breaking a mandate from the governor, but he was acting like a foolish, irresponsible tyrant. Laws are made through legislature that has a process, and then it gets signed down by the executive branch and articulated to the judicial branch. That process was completely circumvented. So we didn't think we were actually breaking the law. We were actually upholding the law. And so we met as a church. We were the largest public gathering in the state of Washington. And we met every week, and nobody died, and hospitals didn't get overrun, and we didn't cause super spreaders. And the week we started gathering again was the week he had declared singing to be illegal. So you could cheer at a football game, or you could scream at a BLM march, but you couldn't sing in church. And we were like, no, that's not cool. Yeah. So we gathered, and we broke the law by singing Amazing Grace.
Yeah, you did. And John Newton cheered in heaven. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do in the next few minutes, Josh, is I aggregated questions from our people and online. The reason I started with that story is one of the most common questions that was submitted, and we got some spicy ones, heads up.
Yeah.
One of the most common questions that was submitted goes directly to what you just said. So here you go. So obviously, what we're not advocating is for Christians to be lawless people. In fact, Christians are supposed to be the exact opposite of that. We are rule of law people. That's our thing.
Yes. Yes.
However, here's the question. When is it okay for Christians to practice civil disobedience and break the law? Doesn't Romans 13 say that, Josh, you were supposed to obey and submit to governing authorities?
Yeah. Okay, so there's a long answer or a really long answer.
Do the first one, and then I may ask for the second one.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean long because there's a deep tradition in Protestantism and in fact in church history and in the Bible where doing exactly the opposite of what you just said Christians say we can't do are being done constantly. So what Christians are so ignorant and naive of is that most of the men that they would flag as heroes historically they were butting heads with the government of their time. And so I tell her, Romans 13 is so wildly misunderstood and misapplied. That's why I say it's a long answer, because you got to go untangle it. First, you got to go read Romans 13. Just go read it. So don't quote it, go read it. And then when you read it, you see that government is an institution ordained by God. which means by default they have derivative authority.
That's it. Bingo.
Which means that by default they're submitted to God, His moral and His natural law. Which means they are empowered by God as His, big fancy word, His vicegerent or His earthly representative of heaven. Like they're given power to actually exercise authority, because government always has to do with authority and power, right? So we don't believe authority is bad or power is bad. Power, our God is all powerful. We're made in His image. You're given power as a man, Josh, to exercise that, to bless your wife and protect your family. So authority is good and power is good, constrained inside the boundaries that God has set. So we believe there are 3 human spheres or institutions or jurisdictions that God has created to function inside a nation for that nation to thrive. And then this goes into a political theory of social systems. So you have tribalism, which we believe leads to anarchy, a decentralization of power. You have tyranny, which is a centralization of power, or you have globalism, or you have nationalism. I believe that nations are God's design to bless large groups of people, and so you see anarchy. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to click on something you just said, Josh, because I think it's important for our people to hear. Christians are getting thrown, and we may hit this in 5 or 6 minutes. Christians keep getting thrown. It's like a scare label right now of, hey man, you're about Christian nationalism. You're one of those nationalists. I just want to point out something you just said and do a verbal highlighter. So what a lot of people hear when they hear nationalism right now, particularly with like secular progressive media, nationalism is a dirty word because they're assuming what they're saying is that, oh man, you have an idolatry of your nation. And what you're saying is, first of all, there's a difference between idolatry and patriotism. We can get to that later. But what you're saying that I want to point out is that when we talk about globalism, nationalism, or tribalism, we're not talking about the order of allegiances in our hearts. We're talking about the sphere of governments that God has established. So, for instance, Josh just pointed this out. I'm highlighting this for the people that are listening, is that really you have 3 options. You either globalism, hey man, we have a one world government. That's the sphere that should exist. Or tribalism. Hey, you have tiny little factions with little tribes that are governed and they're all warring against each other. And as Josh pointed out, leads to anarchy. But then in the Bible, what I want to point out that Josh just said is the spheres of government that God has established according to the scriptures is nationalism. That's not talking about a heart level allegiance. I love my nation more than Jesus. That's not what that's talking about. That's talking about the sphere of government that God has deemed wisest, given the fallenness of mankind. So I just want to point that out. We'll get to Christian nationalism later. I'm sorry I interrupted you. You can keep going. Why were you not sinning by quote unquote breaking the law? Romans 13. Keep going.
Yeah. So the short answer is, whenever a government requires something that God forbids or forbids something that God requires, we're bound to a higher allegiance to obey Jesus and not man. And so we see this example with the apostles in Acts 4 and Acts 5. They say, hey, stop preaching the gospel. And the apostles say, you know what? We can't not talk about what we've heard. And they say, stop preaching the gospel or you're going to harm public safety. And they say, well, we have to obey God, not man. We see this in Daniel where he stands up, and then he stands against the government. We see this with the Hebrew midwives where the Egyptian Pharaoh says, kill all the newborn Hebrew sons. And they say, actually, we're not going to do that, but we're not going to tell you, we're going to lie about it. So they lie about it. We see it with the wise men when Herod says, hey, tell me where you find Jesus. And then the angel says, he asked you to tell him where Jesus is so he can kill Jesus. You obey us, not King Herod. Don't tell him where Jesus was. We see this, all throughout. We see this with Samuel, the prophet Samuel. God says, hey, go anoint David as king. And he says, what if they stop me? And God tells him, tell him you're out running an errand. God tells the prophet Samuel to lie to governing officials because, and here's the thing that Christians lost, is there is a power and authority source higher than the government. And that power and authority source is God himself. So government is functioning as one of 3 institutions that God's given to a nation for that nation to flourish: the family, the church, and the civil magistrate. That civil magistrate is under the authority of God, and they've been given clear lanes to function inside of. If they move outside those lanes, they're acting in disobedience to God, and it's up to the citizens of that nation to remind them. That's why we have a government that's shaped by the consent of the people. That's a biblical concept because the government, as designed by God, as taught in his word, is to be held accountable to the consent of the people and the God that the government will give an answer to. And so they're an institution of God. They're a vicegerent of God, meaning God gives the government quite a bit of power. And I don't want that to be missed. I am pro the government wielding the sword to bring justice to a nation. And so that is where I would it would come to a point for me when I look at the different spheres of society. The church has been given the ministry of the word and sacraments. The family has been given the ministry of health, welfare, and education of the family and children. The government has been given the ministry of justice. That means explicitly two things. They're to constrain and punish evil, and they're to promote and reward good. Now, that's very key because we think we've reinterpreted Romans 13 to say the government is to do good. That's not what Romans 13 says. Romans 13 says that 3 times that the government is God's servant, or literally, it's the word diakonos, what we get the word deacon from. They're God's servant, so they're working for God, which means they're accountable to God, which means they got to do what God tells them to do. They're God's servant for our good, to encourage us to do good. And so that's a huge differentiation. When we think the government is supposed to do good, then we'll support them absconding taxes from us to do our job. The government is not to do good. The government is to create a framework for us as the church and individuals and families to do the good things. We're the ones that are responsible for health, welfare, education, and all these things that the government has taken over and I think really caused more damage than good in the name of good.
All right, so I just want to
I was all over the map there, but
no, dude. No, bro, this is fantastic. There's like 10 things we can click on. I just want to point out something you just said. So you just said, and by the way, I totally obviously agree, that Romans 13 says the role of the government is to restrain evil and facilitate good. Not do good, but what's the language
reward
there?
Good.
Reward good. It says restrain evil, reward good is what you got there. Now, can I point something out?
Yeah.
Yes. But then obviously then the question is, okay, well, who gets to define evil and good? And the obvious answer from Romans 13 is, well, God does, because God's an authority over the government. Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. Okay. But Josh, let me go to question number 2 that is very, very common for Christians. And I got some very strong opinions here, and we need to help some of our people with this. But hey, Josh, but aren't you then advocating for a theocracy? It sounds like you're saying that Christians should be voting to force their beliefs on people who don't share them. Shouldn't there be a separation of church and state?
Okay. This is like red meat. I have to work at not getting like visibly agitated here. Okay. So
yeah, me too. That's why I did it.
Okay. So first of all, no one even knows what a theocracy is. If you pushed on that, they're like, well, So here's the reality of the nation that you live in, you saphead. Okay.
It's a podcast.
Yeah. So let's just back up. And this is indisputable. Our nation was founded on explicitly Christian and biblical values, full stop. Which means it won't work with any other worldview at play. One of the reasons our nation is broken right now is because we're trying to drive a diesel engine by putting water in the tank. I mean, Benjamin Franklin said this, James Madison said this, George Washington said this, Thomas Jefferson said this. All of them spoke very, very explicitly to the fact that there's no framework of government that can constrain evil if the people are evil. And so they made very clear cases for, I think Albert Einstein said, if you say that religion and politics shouldn't be mixed, you're ignorant of both. That was Albert Einstein who said that. And so the founding fathers are very, very clear. This experiment in freedom won't work if it gets disconnected from the explicitly Christian Protestant worldview that it was born from. Okay. And so, we're not trying to go into constitutional theory here, but everything from our law and justice system to the nature of the Declaration of Independence to the nature of our, Constitution, all of them are explicitly Christian. In other words, there's more direct and indirect references to the book of Deuteronomy in the Constitution and the Declaration than there is to Rousseau or John Locke. Yeah. We have to understand that Rutherford was writing in defense of freedom the same time he was writing the Westminster Confession that we hold to as believers. At the same time, he was At the same time, he was mentoring a high school kid named John Locke, who eventually did a bunch of writing that a young kid named Tom Jefferson was reading. John Locke coined the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of property because and Thomas Jefferson put a spin on it, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because our founding fathers viewed happiness and private property ownership as synonymous. And he learned that from John Locke, who was discipled by the guy who wrote the Westminster Confession. So, and we can do this all day, right? We were explicitly shaped as a Christian nation, and one of the reasons, we are totally in the pawpaw patch here, so just interrupt me anytime you want. But one of the reasons I believe that the secularist and the atheist and the let's say the woke anti-God crowd are trying to disconnect our current day reality from our history and our heritage is because they don't want to acknowledge the fact that the greatest nation the world has ever known was born out of a Christian worldview.
That's right. Can I click on this? Like when people, yeah, that's right. I just want to say, if you want the fruit, you have to accept the root. And
that's exactly right.
That's right. When people look at what America has, what the United States has produced, and by the way, neither of us are saying that our nation's been perfect. I mean, there's obviously been massive missteps. All the things, colonial slavery, all the stuff. But when you get to things like religious liberty and the capitalism that raised people out of the, millions of people out of poverty, et cetera,
yes,
things as particularly like freedom, religious liberty,
yes,
et cetera, those are fruits that grew out of the roots of a Protestant theological belief framework. And
that's exactly right.
For our listeners, I just want them to hear that. Like sometimes people will hear separation of church and state, and you're trying to erase liberty and that kind of thing and impose your. Right. I'm like, no, hang on, guys. Right. Where do you think religious liberty and freedom came from? Those are fruits that grew off the roots of the tree that came out of Protestantism. And by the way, I would just point this out, and you can push back if you disagree. From my understanding, that secular nations, Islamic nations, other nations, those frameworks do not result in religious liberty.
No.
There is one ideological framework that has historically resulted in particularly religious liberty and liberty for people, and that is a Protestant theological belief framework. So let's go back. So Josh, when somebody's...
Because you got no, we can't forget that they got on a boat and came over here because they were being persecuted for their religious beliefs, and they wanted to exercise their religious beliefs freely. And allow that for other people as well. And so you just can't, even the separation of church and state, that's not a phrase in the Declaration, in the Bill of Rights, or in the Constitution. It was a phrase taken from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote a buddy like 20 years later. He's trying to describe, hey, we have to have the church involved in the state or we're screwed. What we have to be careful is make sure that the state doesn't get involved in the church. So the authority has been abused when when the state wields the church to work through it. That was what happened in England. Or when the church when the state persecutes the church, as what's happening, like let's say in China right now. But we could go a lot of directions, but we just have to get clear on that. Otherwise, we'll take a phrase that the founders didn't even use or intend, twist its meaning, and then remove the heart of the very thing that they said is what makes this nation work.
Bingo. Yeah, I just like here's how sometimes I'll say it when I'm explaining to people. Tell me if you would say this differently or if you would add, subtract, multiply. So number one, what we have to remember is what you just pointed out. Separation of church and state, that was in a letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association. It's not in the Constitution. The purpose of, first of all, let me just say, separation of church and state does not mean the separation of morality and state. That would be evil.
No.
It does not mean the separation of politics and religion. That is impossible. What it means is it's a separation of governments. That the same dude that is the president shouldn't also be a functional pope. It's talking about a separation of governments.
That's right.
And it was originally written, Thomas Jefferson writing the Danbury Baptist, that phrase was used to provide a quote-unquote wall of separation so that the state wouldn't interfere with the church. Like, for instance, the state telling churches they have to shut down for 2 years. Yeah, let me just let that stop right there. Let me just let that stay right there.
Let's just soak on that one for a little bit. Yeah.
So, and I just want to point this out. And again, Josh, if there's anything you want to click on, here's why, if you're a listener, here's why I'm pointing this out. If you're a Christian, you are going to get gaslit with this phrase. You're going to get beat over the head, gaslit with this phrase over and over and over again. So let me point a couple things out. Where do I want to go with this? Okay, so the whole concept of You can't force your beliefs on people who don't share them. Let me just point this out. Guys, that is what literally everyone is doing in a constitutional republic. We call it a democracy. Literally every voter in America is advocating in their voting patterns for some belief that they have that others don't share. So for instance, when people say to you as a Christian, you can't force your beliefs on other people, it's very interesting. A lot of times people use that with relation to the abortion conversation, and they'll be like, you're trying to force your beliefs on the mother. Doug Wilson has pointed this out. You're trying to force your beliefs on the mother. Well, hey man, what you're doing in your pro-choice advocacy is you want the mother to be able to force her beliefs on the baby. So listen, so somebody's morality is always getting legislated. The question is not whether morality will get legislated. The question is whose morality will get legislated. Will true godly morality get legislated, or will false godless morality get legislated? If you're a Christian who hears this phrase like, hey, you should stop advocating for your beliefs in the public square, separation of church and state, don't force your beliefs on other people. Interestingly, in America, it's okay for every population segment to vote for their beliefs. The only people in our society who get shamed for it are Christians.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So you just need to see the illogic here, is what I'm saying.
That's right. The people that are demanding you shut up are screaming at you.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
So what we have to realize is this whole concept of you can't legislate morality is absolutely crazy. Every legislation is an act of morality because every legislation is trying to do one of two things: constrain evil or promote good, which means you have to take one step back and go, who gets to define what is good and who gets to define what is evil? And so what we're saying is our nation was built on the natural and moral law of God. We have a constitution that was put in place to keep the government from growing into tyranny. And then we have men established through the separation of powers in our three-branch government, in the legislature, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, that actually mirrors the image of God. So what I would say is the system, and again, nations just, I think, provide the opportunity for people to do the most good, but nations can be evil if the law that they live by is evil. So one of the things that Isaiah rebukes a nation for is he says, woe to you and woe to the nations that call evil good and good evil. And so when we have laws that are actually punishing righteous people and rewarding evil people, we are now an illegitimate or an evil government, and we must stand up. I mean, one of the things I've wrestled with, Josh, I've said this to my church, so I'm okay saying it here, and I say this carefully, but I've gone through a personal grieving process to come to the realization that if we don't turn things around as a nation, we might not always be the good guys.
We're becoming the bad guys.
We could become the purveyors of perversion and evil on the world. And then when you take and here's the crazy thing. Yeah. Progressive liberals never build anything, they abscond things. So you have a conservative-minded creative builds Disney, and then it gets absconded by the crazy woke left and now wielded for evil. So conservatives build universities, they build seminaries, they build colleges, and then they come in and they get absconded, like Harvard, like Yale, like all these schools that started as Christian seminaries. And same thing with a nation. It's the conservative mindset and the biblical parameters that built our nation, and now it's being taken over at the top, and it could very well be wielded for evil if we're not careful. We have at that point a moral obligation to the world and to God and to our own families to stand against it, increasingly so the crazier it gets. And so one of the texts that I used for our church to demonstrate why we should be more involved in politics is Proverbs 13. A good man leaves an inheritance for his children, not just financially, spiritually, or relationally, but socially. Meaning the world that we hand our children, the world that we build, pray for, vote in, and vocalize in will either be better or worse, stronger or weaker, righteous or less righteous, depending on how we lived. And we could hand our kids a broken inheritance if we remove our voice from the public square of politics.
That's exactly right. So I just want to point out what you just said, Josh, like over it with a verbal highlighter. So I'll just point this out. 40 million Bible-believing Christians did not vote in the last presidential election. That presidential election was decided by 42,000 votes. I just want to pause and let that sink in. 40 million Christians didn't vote in the last presidential election. That election was decided by 42,000 votes. By the way, if you're a person who's like, wait, dude, they're making it sound like this is really easy, cut and dry, left, right, evil, good. I'm going to get to this here in a second because that's you're going to hear a little pushback on that here in a second. But I do just want to say, like, for everybody listening, hey, man, we are commanded to be salt and light. Jesus did not say to be salt and light in the church. Just keep your beliefs in the church.
That's right.
He said to be salt and light in the world. And when godly people abdicate their voice in society and the world, we abdicate our biblical responsibility to do that. Well, nature hates a vacuum. Guess who fills that vacuum? When godly people don't advocate for their beliefs, then godless people fill that void. That will always happen. There's no other way for it to happen.
That's right.
Now, let me just go back. Oh, go ahead, and then I want to go back to the left-right binary thing.
Yeah, I was just going to say the three spheres of human institutions or human sovereignty that God created: family, church, and state. We're all given very clear parameters, lanes of responsibility with authority and power that's limited to accomplish the task God gave them. One of the reasons that's so important is because when we come to this issue of government or politics, we need to listen to how people are talking in politics with a biblical filter, so that when they're talking about doing things in government that God has given the family to do, we should think, no, that's not right. And you either vote against it or you work against it locally. But the point I want to say is, it's not the church's job to be a dad, and it's not the church's job to chase after criminals and punish them. But it is the church's job to strengthen dads and governments to do their job well.
Bro, that's great.
And so this whole demonic lie that says the church shouldn't be involved in politics has actually. It's a propaganda psyop from the pit of hell to silence the church from doing their job, which is to be the conscience of a nation. The job of a church is to exercise the ministry of the word so as to be the conscience of a nation, so that when those family members grow up in their family and then they go into politics, they're carrying with them the morality and the worldview that the church shaped through the preaching of the Word of God. Because make no mistakes, every legislation has at its root some sort of morality, some sort of version of right and wrong, which is why, yes, we need more Christian influence in our politics. So we need more Christian influence in our culture, because politics is following culture.
I just want to add some addendums here and point out some things you just said. So one, I want to dovetail what you just said. You know, you're saying, hey, every nation is going to have a morality. So for instance, if you're a Christian listening to this and you're hearing constantly on CNN or whatever it is, like the danger of Christian nationalism. You know, Josh just pointed out every nation has a morality. The question is not the question is not whether morality gets legislated. The question is whose morality gets legislated. So when somebody says, and again, this is a little, I've heard Doug Wilson, I've read him say this. When somebody says this, the Christian nationalism, like, hey man, so what are your options? Somebody's morality is going to get legislated in a nation. So, okay, you object to Christian nationalism. Do you want secular nationalism? Do you want Islamic nationalism? What kind of nationalism do you want? Because the question is not whether morality gets legislated. The question is whose morality gets legislated. So we just want to point that out. Now let me go back to something you said earlier, Josh. So you were talking about, hey, woke progressive left, and obviously we probably share a lot of alignment on the dangers that are there. But somebody who's listening may go, dude, you're making it sound like it's just so cut and dry, and everything on the right is good, and everything on the left is bad. It's just clear cut, good and evil. Respond to that person.
Yes. I'm glad I'm being understood. No. Okay, you want me to nuance this? I'll try to nuance it. I'm not sure there is any nuance there. And so let me first say this. There are lost people on the right and on the left. Duh. But increasingly so, politically speaking, you have one party that is advocating for explicitly evil and immoral things socially. And you have another party that isn't as much. And so when I look at it, I realize the desire not to make things simple and binary, but it's pretty simple. It was more complicated 30 or 40, 50 years ago. When you had Protestants and Catholics on both sides of the aisles, and they were arguing over the best way to accomplish the same thing. They both had the same ends, and they were wrestling over which way should we get there. Well, then it gets political, and then the church shouldn't really be speaking into how we should pave roads, or where reservoirs should get built, or how best to set up the city sewer system, whatever. That's not our purview. But when politics slides into the realm of morality, if the church fails to speak to those issues just because someone calls it political, we're failing to do our job. And more, I'm hearing less conversation about politics in politics and more conversations about morality in politics. And let's just be honest, the morality of the current progressive political left is unexplicitly and unequivocally evil. We just have to call it that. Now, does that mean that everyone on the right is righteous? No, that's not what we're saying at all.
Of course not.
That's naive. And so, but what I am saying is there is a lesser of two evils that is becoming increasingly obvious, and it's just not as nuanced as some people want to try to make it.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question?
Totally. And you may disagree with me on a couple things here, but let me just tell you how I'll sometimes explain this to people. And this is the least filtered I've ever been in something that my church is going to hear. But if you're a Lake Point member, here's my conviction on this. I think it is unfair to you to not know what your pastor thinks. If you're a Lake Point member that's listening, I think that people deserve to know what their pastor thinks about things that matter from a spiritual, moral perspective. So here's my take on this is, and Josh, I've heard you use some of this language. I think that that a concept of a moral symmetry or maybe an amoral symmetry was a little more, I'd use the word understandable a few decades ago when, like you pointed out, once upon a time, the two parties really agreed on the destination. They just differed on how to get there. It's like, do we do that through higher taxes and blah, 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 or do we do that through lower taxes and, free market economy, but everybody wanted to get the same place. As a lot of my friends who historically would have maybe more aligned or felt comfortable on the left, as a lot of these people have shared with me in the last few years, it's that language of, dude, I didn't leave the left left me. And where it's what you're seeing right now is that the left is it's getting hijacked by, this is language that I've had friends from the left use with me. Man, our deal is getting hijacked by secular progressivism so that now, man, we're not agreeing on the same outcome anymore. And so I do, and this may bother some people that are listening, I do just want to be honest. I am not saying that everything that happens on the right is good and everything that happens on the left is evil. I am explicitly not saying that. I do think that there comes a moment where I just need to be honest, that pastors that I need to be honest, that there is not a way for me to articulate moral symmetry between the parties anymore. When you've got this deal where it's like, by the way, everything I'm getting ready to say, I'm literally quoting Josh, that Josh, okay? It's that whole deal, that Josh, right. I'm quoting you, that deal where people are going, man, well, hey, Pastor Josh and Pastor Josh, it sounds like you're quote unquote getting political. You're getting more political. And that's your deal of, what's happened in the last few years is not that the church and pastors are getting more political. It's that politics are getting more theological and spiritual. When the government moved past things like teaching math, building roads, issuing driver's licenses, to things like redefining marriage, erasing gender, reframing infant murder as reproductive rights, and then using the government school system to indoctrinate people's kids to believe all of those things. Hey guys, the church didn't move, the government and politics moved. And when that happens, Josh, can you do your whole thing on the lanes? And sometimes you got to dust up somebody's bumper.
Yeah, well, it's just working with the three spheres of human institutions or human sovereignty of family, church, and government. Family is in a sports car, and they're pretty nimble in their lane. And then the church is like a party bus, got a lot of folks on it. And then the government is a few guys driving a huge 18-wheeler. And they're moving a lot of stuff. And so there's difference in size and weight and mobility and agility. and they're each in their own lane. And as long as they're in their own lane, traffic is moving fine. They can get from point A to point B. Everyone's happy. The problem is when, quite frankly, anyone in their lane starts trying to move. So, for instance, if as a dad, someone, let's say, robbed my home, and I decide I'm going to chase that guy down and kill him, I'm out of my lane, swerving over into the government's lane, and that little teeny car could wreck that whole semi because vigilantes can destabilize a society. It's not my job to chase down bad guys and exercise a sword. I can defend my family in an acute situation, but I'm not given the power by God to go hunt down and punish criminals like the government is. Conversely, if the government, with a few guys driving that semi, start edging over into other lanes, I believe it's actually the job of the church and that party bus to come alongside the government and like honk the horn and go, hey, you're drifting, wake up. Are you asleep? Did you fall asleep? Have you had too much to drink? Like, stay in your lane. And the more that semi of government drifts into their lane, I think it's the job of the church to rub some paint. And what happened with COVID is the church dynamited the brakes, backed off, and was no longer in play. And the semi had a clear path from its lane into the individual's lane, and it wiped everybody out.
All right. But Josh, Jesus stayed out of politics. He said to give to Caesar what's Caesar's and to give to God what's God's. And shouldn't the church stay out of politics and just focus on evangelism?
Are you just trying to bug me?
Yeah. So legit, dude. So here's what like I'm asking you the most common questions that were submitted. So this is stuff that I know you get that, but this is stuff that real Christians, they're like trying to figure out. How do I think about this?
I know. Yeah. I'm not mean to laugh and mock it.
I know that.
I'm like, are we still doing this?
Yeah.
I know. Yeah. And so Jesus stayed out of politics. It's just the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Jesus is Lord over politics. My gosh.
Okay.
So it's like if politics is the process of making decisions for a large group of people, that's government, and Jesus is over. He's Lord over everything. Okay. Interesting. Jesus said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." He held up the coin, and the point he was making was what? He was like, "This coin has Caesar's image on it, so he has rights to it." What is he leaving unsaid? Whatever else has a higher authority's image on it, give that. So Jesus is like, this coin may have Caesar's image on it, give it to him, whatever, who cares? You have my image on it. Mankind was made in my image. Children, unborn children who are made in the image of God, they're mine. Don't give to Caesar what is God's, namely our allegiance and our love and our very life. And so when we say that Jesus wasn't involved in politics, it's like, my God, Jesus created politics. He's Lord over politics, and he created the parameters in which politics is to function. So when Paul goes on, interesting to note, at the end of that section that everyone quotes in Romans 13, he talks about taxes. Did you know that? He says, therefore, pay. I'm trying to look if I can look up the text real quick.
Pay taxes. Basically, pay your taxes, pay your tithe.
Yeah, he says, this is also why you pay taxes, so the authorities that got through it can do their job. Paul is tying the paying of taxes to government, helping government do its job. Paul is not saying pay the government to do things that aren't its job. Like, I think Paul would make a case, and this, I don't know if you can erase this in the podcast if you like. I think Christians should consider more the moral dilemma of having taxes absconded from them to go towards immoral and evil ends. I think that's a question Christians should wrestle with, because Paul says very clearly. Yeah.
I've never wrestled with that. I've never wrestled with that question before. That's
It's okay to pay taxes if it's going toward the end of government fulfilling its duties. Paul's not arguing for funding a machine that's wielding authority in order to oppress people and do evil. And so I just think we're in new territory here as a nation. And as Christians, we have to think thoroughly, more critically, more sophisticated, and more biblically. Otherwise, we might be part and parcel of promoting and perpetuating the problem.
So here in a second, because I know a lot of people listening, here's the question you're asking. And by the way, I deeply understand this question. When you're hearing us a second ago talk about, hey, right and left and acknowledging moral asymmetry, a lot of you are going, yeah, dude, but like the guy the right's running is a vulgar, admitted adulterer that's joked about violating women and lived a godless lifestyle. Like, what are you talking about? So if you're a listener, I'm coming back to that in just a second. So just hang tight. I'm coming back to that in just a second. That must be addressed. It must be addressed. But I do. So I'm not as smart as you, Josh. So instead of having paragraphs, I have little one sentence words that rhyme, like run, spot, run. So whenever somebody does the hey, give to Caesar what is Caesar and to God is this God's. So I just want to point this out. This is my one line answer when somebody says that. Jesus' point was that wherever God's image is found, that belongs to God. That means Caesar belongs to God.
That's exactly right.
Caesar, every human leader, every president, every king, every Caesar is created in God's image. So one of the implications, people go, man, so that means what Caesar does and what God wants are totally separate. One of the implications of Jesus saying that is Caesar belongs to God should bend his knee to the lordship of Jesus to rule and reign for righteous purposes. Now, let me go back to something, Josh.
Psalm 2.
Oh, Psalm 2. Is that the kiss the Son?
Yeah, I mean, nations will be given a chance to repent, and the nation that refuses to repent, God will break. And then he says, kiss the Son, and take refuge in him, lest God be angry with you. And what we fail to forget is, like I preached a series on politics in my church a few weeks ago, and I said, where should we go for a text on politics? I said, let's refer to that little-known, obscure text in Matthew where Jesus tells us to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. I was like, that's where we're going to start, because politics is a part of loving God with our mind, heart, soul, and strength. And politics is one of the most explicit ways we love a broader group of neighbors. And so I think you can tie Christians being active in a redemptive sense in politics right back to the greatest command, because it's how we love God. And here's the thing, is God calls nations to obey the greatest command, to love him above all else, and to do good to their neighbor, just to support what you were saying.
So let me go back to, so what I'm getting ready to say, Josh, not even close, by far, probably by a 5X margin, most common question submitted by people was, hey dude, I hear you on a lot of this stuff. Yeah. It's not as clean and simple as everything that happens on the left is bad and everything that happens on the right is good. It's just not that simple. You and I agree. It's not that simple. We would agree with moral asymmetry. I don't think we're saying it's that clean and simple. But the big thing that people are saying, and you might disagree, that's fine. The big thing that people are saying is they're going, hey dude, what do I do when I'm looking at two candidates, neither of whom meet my standards of righteousness for what I would want in a leader as a Christian? And you may disagree with this. I don't think you do. Any Christian with his or her eyes open should feel that way right now. Any Christian with his or her eyes open should feel that way right now. And so, hey man, it's like, what do I do when neither candidate is a pillar of Christ-like righteousness like I would want in a leader? And then correlated to that, so hey, statistically, most Christians are going to vote for a guy that's vulgar, an admitted adulterer, has joked about, violating women, lived a godless lifestyle. What do I do with this, man? Neither candidate fits for me.
Yeah. Well, you talking on a national level?
Yes.
Yeah. Because on a local level, my answer is if there's no one good one running, then you should run, because all politics are local.
Ooh.
On the national level, in relationship to this question, there's a couple ways I'd answer it. First of all, there's never been a perfect candidate, and so I was saying that when George Bush was running. It's not like there's. I mean, like my grandma, God rest her soul, loved JFK. And that guy, wow. Yeah. I mean, he makes Solomon look like a slow day. I mean, and so it's not as if, so that's the first, and there's never been a perfect candidate. The second thing I would say is we're not voting for a pastor. And so oftentimes I think that the rubric of elder qualified pastor gets put over a politician, and they're just not the same thing. The third thing I would say is, and this might be controversial, and so and we might even disagree. We might even disagree on this, but everyone has done varying degrees of sin and bad things. First of all, we believe in grace as Christians. We believe in forgiveness. We believe in progressive sanctification, and we believe that people can change. I honestly, Trump's person. Let's just talk names. Can we talk names?
Yeah, I mean, everybody knows what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not. This isn't mystery here. Trump's personality can be obnoxious sometimes. I mean, we've talked about that. I was like, what is he? Why is he saying that? What is he doing? Eye roll, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think he's grown. I think he's changed. I actually don't think he is the horrifically perverted, dirty old man that everyone makes him out to be. And I could be wrong on that, but I've known enough people that are 2 or 3 people removed from him who are like, his employees love him, his family loves him, his kids love him, his ex-wives loves him, his grandkids love him. He's a good he takes care of his people. There's something to be said for that. When a man's family and employees speak well of him. Again, I'm not saying he's the Pope, but he may not be as despicable as he gets made out to be. As a man can grow and change over time. Now, I'm not saying I would want him to be my pastor, but I'm just saying he's done a lot of good too. Secondly, I love him in concept, and I'll tell you why. I think the founders had in their mind for politicians to be a season of life thing, not a professional career path. Meaning, you work hard, you start businesses, you build companies, you build the nation, you build the culture, you create value, you employ people, you work hard at a business, you get to experience our nation on the ground. And then once you've built your wealth, built your businesses, had your family, grown your family, launched your family, as a season of life, now you're freed financially to give back, you go into politics. And what that person does is they bring their experience in the marketplace, they bring their experience with what's broken, they bring the work ethic that you find in the private sector that's often lacking in public sectors. They bring that into government, and with that perspective, they're there not as a career move or a career path. They're there to work for change so that the people that lived their life can do what they did better. I read Phil Knight's book, Shoe Dog. It's an incredible book.
Oh, that is such a good book.
It's one of my top 5 favorite books, right? And we'd probably have a lot of disagreements politically, or I would at least with Phil. But the saddest part of that story is he gets to the end, and in the last chapter he says, sadly, because of the way our nation has drifted, you couldn't do today what I did then. Meaning the Phil Knights who are being born today couldn't start Nike because of the bureaucratic regulatory tyranny that we're under. And he even acknowledges that the people he voted for and the policies that he promoted have created an atmosphere that would keep him from doing what he did 40 years ago. Okay? And so now, if Phil Knight went into politics, I'd be like, hey, go for it. I may disagree with him, but he's the kind of candidate that the founders had in mind, not as a career path or a professional politician, but as a season of life where you take all of your private experience and you now help shape government to create more flourishing for those people who are still in the private sector. Does that make sense?
It does.
The last thing I'll say is this. When I think about the 2 candidates we have running for national office, I just personally, I look past the candidates. I look past their personalities. So both candidates, let's be honest, are easy to make fun of because they have really quirky and unique personality quirks. One is a cackling hyena and the other is an orange man time bomb who could say anything at any moment, whether it's appropriate or not, right? And so it's like both candidates have a lot of personality material to work with on Saturday Night Live. My job is to look past the personality to the policy that they're promoting.
Policy, yeah.
Okay? Because personalities come and go, policies we live with for a long time. And then the last thing I'll say is every person, specifically the president, brings with them a team. Okay? And so you're not just voting for him or for her, You're voting for the thousands of people that they will appoint into positions of authority on their cabinet, at the White House, and in judges. And the question is, who do we think will more likely appoint people with our belief system, with a Christian worldview, into positions of power? One or the other. And I think there's no question, because we have a track record of both. We have a track record of one who was in office 4 years ago, and we have a track record of one who's been in office the last 3.5 years, and we can see the kind of policies they promote, and the people that they put in power. And so that's what guides me more than the personalities and how they handle themselves in a debate, because I want to vote for the candidate that is most likely to appoint common sense, God-fearing, wisdom-guided, righteous people who have a moral definition from the Word of God as to right or wrong. Those people in power, I believe, will do more good than people that have no moral rudder.
Yeah, so I'll jump in and give a couple things. You know, I may have a slightly lower view of Donald Trump's personal character, I'm not defending him. I mean, it's like of
I
course
just don't think he's as evil as some make him out to be. But he's no angel. I get that.
That's exactly right. There's a few things that I would say here is, number one, I think it's what you just said. I would just highlight is, dude, as a Christian, like what we're doing. So think about the analogy Jesus used. You got Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus is like, hey man, your job, Christians, everywhere you go, is to be salt in the world. We both know this. Salt is a preservative. It slows decay. So what a Christian should be asking when they're evaluating candidates is which set of policies is going to slow societal decay to the greatest degree. So sometimes I do feel like very legitimate, earnest, loving, well-meaning Christians with good, sensitive consciences, they will have an internal wrestle about voting for this candidate with a deep character flaw. And I think what I would say is, man, I think that's a little bit of misunderstanding what a vote is. A vote is not a Valentine. a vote is not like, ooh, they give me the warm fuzzies and I like you. Do you like me? A vote is also a vote is also not an endorsement. A vote is not. You may disagree. A vote is not an endorsement of everything that a person 100%. Does or says. What a vote for a Christian is it's a strategic decision between which person and set of policies will slow societal decay the most. Let me say one more thing here. It's really interesting.
Just when I vote, I'm not putting my hope in who I vote in. I give a lot of thought and time and reading to the candidates and issues before I vote. And then, bro, after I vote, I never think about it again. I go back to my life of trying to make our life better, and I'll hold candidates accountable locally where possible. But I think what you're saying, like the sanctity of the vote, it's not this thing that we just can't get tarnished. It's like, no, it's like I give to ministries. I do my homework, and then I give money to ministries. And then once I give them my money, they're responsible for stewarding it. I don't follow up and go, wait a minute, did you, no. I do my homework on the front end. I give in good faith, and then I entrust them to do what they said they're going to do. And so just to reinforce what you're saying, I interrupted you. You're going to make one more point.
Yeah, well, and dude, first of all, I just want to say I respect people who disagree with this spot. I disagree with the logic. If you disagree with what I'm saying, this is not demeaning. Like when you disagree with people, you disagree with people. I respect people who take a different view on that thing. I just think the biblical logic of our job is to be salt and slow decay. Therefore, just ask who slows decay. I just think that's a lot wise. The other thing that I would say here is, it's been pointed out before that there's a taxonomy of 3 kinds of leaders in the Old Testament, and that you'll notice that there's. I'm going to use J's. So you'll see why in a second. I'm prefacing. I'm using J's. I'm not trying to be too on the nose here.
I'm all excited now.
Yeah. So you have Josiah's. So you have godly leaders, godly men of godly character who advance godly purposes in a kingdom. You have so that's just Josiah's. On the other hand, you have Jezebel and Ahab. That's why I don't want to be too on the nose here, but you have you have leaders of godless.
Hey, the shoe fits.
No. You have leaders of godless character who are advancing godless agendas. That's what Ahab and Jezebel did. And then you have a third category that I think Christians sometimes forget and don't have space for in their logic. Is you have a Jehu, who was a deeply flawed man. Very deeply flawed man, some deep character issues, and God uses this very flawed leader to do some very
Yeah.
important and righteous things. And he slows decay. And I think sometimes Christians get caught up in a binary taxonomy. Either they're this or they're this, or I can't,
Right.
And actually, man, we need to have a little more wisdom than that. There's a greater taxonomy there. That feels really important. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've never heard that. I really like that. That's really good.
Let me do one last thing here, man.
Yeah.
Is say let's in some ways I'm saving the most important for last. I'll be really honest, and you may disagree. Is one of my fears is I'll get a little charismatic on us here.
Let's
hey
go.
man, what we don't want to do is almost get into a spot where we have what I'd call we're moving past engaging in politics and parties, and we really get to the spot where people have. I do think there's a spiritual element where people get a political or a party spirit, and this is where you get people who are they're like capital R Republicans and lowercase c Christians, and it's like, hey, dude, this is doing something not good to you. So will you just finish maybe talking about, hey, what dangers are there for Christians as they start to engage? We don't want our politics and political engagement to malform us out of the character of Jesus.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. You have to vote for Jesus in your heart first. Amen. You have to adopt his word as your constitution that guides and governs your life. And then that's your anchor point for how you view everything he made. So you go into the sphere of family, you go into the sphere of the church, you go into the sphere of civil magistrate with your allegiance anchored in Jesus. And so, like, for instance, I told our church a few weeks ago, Josh, I said, we're going to talk about Jesus in politics for the same reason that we would talk about Jesus in money, or Jesus in sex, or Jesus in food, or Jesus in marriage. God has called us to engage in these things a certain way. The danger, I think, of not talking about Jesus in politics isn't that our allegiance would, put it this way, we think, let's not talk about Jesus in politics so our allegiance won't slide from Jesus to politics. And the irony is, in not talking about Jesus in politics, we can actually put more hope in politics than we should. And so I told our church, I said, we're going to talk about Jesus in politics as a test to make sure that we're worshiping Jesus, not politics.
Oh, that's great, man.
And so, let's take if you never talked about money at your church, the chances are it would increasingly become a temptation to become an idol for people to worship. So you talk about money a lot so people can understand it properly ordered in God's world. Because Jesus said you can worship God or money. You can't worship both. So we don't worship money as God. We worship Jesus and use money to worship Jesus as God. Same thing with politics. If we don't talk about it, it's tempting to put all of our hope there, because politics really affects almost every area of our life. Because politics has to do with making decisions for groups of people in relationship to morality and right and wrong and how they can live or not live. And so it's really affecting every area of our life. And I have to wrestle with this regularly because here's the deal. Let's say my candidate doesn't get into office. Then I'm tempted to be discouraged and frustrated and my hope meter goes down. The danger is the same the other way. My candidate gets in office and, now the world's saved. No. Yeah. Politicians won't save the world. Jesus saves the world. And so we need to have a reserved, a more level-headed thought in terms of, like, if my candidate gets in office, thanks be to God for his grace and mercy, but that's not going to mean I'm going to work any less. I'm going to work harder. If my quote-unquote candidate, I'm not saying mine, I'm saying anyone's, if my candidate doesn't get in office, I'm going to continue working for change and continue looking to Jesus. And this may sound like a bumper sticker cliche, and I want to be careful when I say it, but our hope doesn't rise and fall on who sits in the White House. Our hope is anchored in the one who sits on the throne. And we have to keep that in our mind's eye, or we'll get it out of ink. And so I think right now we're in the ditch of the church not engaging in politics.
Strongly agree.
But if we want it, that's not to say let's swing over and now put our hope in politics. I'm saying
right.
let's be intelligently informed and responsibly engaged so that we can work for the good of of humanity as best as we can in all the spheres God's called us to in family, church, and state.
Yeah, some of the ways I'll articulate what you just said is, so buddy of mine, John Tyson has this brilliant line where he says what secularism does reverse exorcism. It goes throughout society, and wherever it finds God, it says, come out in mankind's name. And so isn't that brilliant? That's so good.
Yeah, it's really good. That's really good.
It's brilliant. So what always happens is in a secular society, politics becomes religion. And I'm going to quote Pastor Mark here. When that happens, candidates start to feel like saviors, campaigning replaces evangelism, rallies start to feel like worship services, election outcomes feel like either salvation or damnation. And if you start feeling like that in your heart, hey, my beloved sister, something is wrong. Yeah. Something is wrong. Yeah. And so, again, I'm quoting Pastor Mark here is, hey man, your biblical convictions may pull your vote left or right, but as a pastor, I'm not trying to pull your heart left or right. I'm trying to pull it up into the kingdom of God. And when your heart gets pulled up, then anointing and blessing comes down. And so, in my heart, I have to do this because I'm a pretty politically aware person. I have to constantly say to my heart, like, hey, dude, somebody is going to get my vote. Nobody gets my heart.
Amen.
Nobody
That's
gets
good,
nobody gets my heart. And what I would say is a little warning sign for you as a Christian, and there's some nuance to what I'm about to say. I kind of hate the word nuance, but there's a little nuance to what I'm about to say. Yeah. Is I would say some warning signals to you as a Christian, if you're a listener, are one, if you adopt a posture of uncritical acceptance of everything your party does. Hey, dude, there's only one infallible voice in the world. And we probably need to check something in our spirit if we're having a posture of uncritical acceptance. The other thing I would say is when you stop believing in the demonic, you have to map those spiritual realities onto physical realities. And so you'll start transposing it. So if politics becomes your religion, then people on the other side become your functional demons. And if you start noticing that you can't have a respectful conversation or a relationship with somebody of a different political persuasion than you. Now, there are some things I would say there because there are some issues of morality, whatever. But if you start noticing that, hey, dude, something's probably off. And if you care more about maybe political persuasion of your neighbor than getting them to Jesus, hey, dude, let's get the gospel into their soul here, and then that's going to do some work. Those are maybe some check engine lights, is what I'd say.
Yep. That's good. And it's interesting. I'm really grateful you're talking about this, Josh, because one of the things I shared with my church was because I think Christians have like the phrase "culture war" gets used to kind of steer Christians away from engaging.
I hate it. I hate it.
And so it's like, yes, we are in a war. The Bible talks about that. Paul talks about that. Jesus talked about that in the wars in the spiritual realm, the heavenlies. And we make war against ideas, right? Against demonic ideas that take over people's minds and guide and govern their lives toward destruction. But one of the things that I've appreciated about you, Josh, is just your fearlessness and your unwillingness to avoid talking about things that people have questions about. So one of the things I've told pastors is that it's disingenuous for you to lack courage in the pulpit, but expect courage from your people in the marketplace.
That's important, Josh.
And so I would just, if there's any pastor, can I talk to pastors real quick? If there are any pastors listening?
Finish it talking to pastors. Let's both finish giving a word to our fellow pastors. Yep.
Okay. Well, first of all, I love you and I pray for you, and I'm grateful and honored to be, linked arm in arm with you. And my encouragement to you would be this: a couple things. One, and I just said it. It's disingenuous to expect courage from your people in the marketplace when you lack courage in the pulpit, because the reality is they're dealing with the effects of politics everywhere they go. Everyone in my church is working somewhere that's asking them to do crazy things that violates their Christian conscience, and they're trying to figure out how to deal with it. So they're having to wrestle with it. You should be addressing it. Number two, don't think that you'll be odd if you talk about politics. you actually be in. One of the reasons I gave our church that we should talk more about church and politics from the pulpit, as I said, because it would put us in step with heaven and history. A political coup occurred in heaven, which is how we got into the mess we're in down here. Okay? And so the whole Bible, one rubric you could use for the entire Bible is God versus government. Because when governments fail to acknowledge God as God, they step into the position of God and try to become him. And so it's our job as prophets, as preachers, as ministers of the Word of God to remind the government of whom the one they're submitted to and whom they'll give an answer to. And so when you don't talk about politics, you're actually out of step with both heaven and with history, because for the vast majority of the last 2,000 years in church history, preachers were regularly, consistently addressing these issues from the pulpit. There's kind of this weird historical anomaly in the last 30 or 40 years where pastors stopped talking about it. Bro, you go back to colonial America. I mean, the air.
I've got a 2-volume set this thick of political sermons by pastors in the 17 and 1800s, and it's this thick. It's a very, very new historical development for people to go, pastors should stay out of these conversations. That's very new.
That's exactly right. So if you're unwilling to talk about it, you're actually out of step with history. So it might sound foreign to your ears, but not to the saints' ears over time. I mean, the air that the founders were breathing was shaped by Protestant preaching, which is reflected in the government they shaped. But then the last thing that I would tell pastors and encourage them in this, and this isn't a license to get on a soapbox, but to be honest, there used to be, how to word this, Josh? You can help, let me say this, and then you're so good at wordsmithing, you can maybe say it in a more succinct way, okay? And I don't say this to say I was duplicitous, but I used to say things differently from the pulpit than I would say in my living room, because I was wanting to be nuanced and speak to all the people and make sure there's room for these people and whatever. And I've stopped doing that, and I told my church, I'm going to saturate my mind in the Word of God, endeavor to walk in the power of the Holy Spirit, be submitted to godly authorities, do my job as a husband and a father, and then get up prepared on Sundays and tell you exactly what I think. Because I think it hurts Christians in churches when pastors have personal convictions that they'll share passionately over dinner, but then they get up in the pulpit and they feel constrained to share those. I think the days of being measured are over. I think you need to say exactly what you think from the pulpit. And I'm not saying like get up on your soapbox. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is the day for being measured and nuanced and talking to all, no. Stop trying to convince the evil that we're okay. Rebuke the foolish, speak to the wise, say what you think, and mean what you say. Would you want to nuance that anymore?
No,
I say that, bro, because I hear pastors tell me all the time, I wish I could say that in my church, but I can't. Or I actually think this, but I never say it. And there might be staff issues or board issues or denominational issues. The pressure's there. I get that. I'm not
family member issues. Family member issues.
Family member issues. Yeah. But what I'm saying is, before God, you're required to be a man of integrity, which means to preach and proclaim your conscience as a Bible-shaped, Spirit-filled, Jesus-saturated man. And so I just want to encourage pastors to stop hiding and start proclaiming. And I'm telling you, people will come out of the woodwork. Your people are starved for you to tell them the truth.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, man, it's hard for me to top that. So I'll do a couple like little summary things. Hey, if you're a pastor, I'd say, hey man, obviously never lose the primacy of evangelism. Never do it. There will be people in hell who had Judeo-Christian values. Charles Spurgeon said, I'm going to rephrase Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon said something like, your Judeo-Christian values can keep you out of jail, but only the blood of Jesus Christ can keep you out of hell. And so, man, hey dude, never, ever lose the primacy of evangelism. But number two, I would just rephrase what Josh just said. If you're a pastor listening, I'm going to use some language like this pastor talk. So if you're not a pastor, you'll be like, what are they talking about? Let me just. Yeah. So I think this is a whole other podcast. We don't have time to do this. I think there was an era of our cultural landscape where reverse engineering your thinking from, man, what's an unchurched person think? and let me try to reverse engineer my emotional calibrations, my language, the topics that I talk about from an unchurched person.
Yeah.
And then a lot of times people would just assume, usually maybe a little more secular progressive thoughts into that. And so then they would reverse engineer their preaching from that. And, I'd say, hey, dude, so watch out, because our guiding principle is Galatians 1 in our preaching. Am I trying to please man, or am I trying to please God? And if I'm trying to please man, I'm no longer a servant of Christ. And so you alluded to this a second ago, Josh. If you're not careful, to our beloved pastor friends, dude, they're figuring out, just like me and you, we're all failing forward together. Dude, just make sure you don't wake up one day and realize you're starving the sheep to attract some goats. And Proverbs taxonomy of wise, foolish, and evil. Wise people with biblical convictions. Foolish people have hearts committed to the word, but their heads haven't been informed yet. And then evil people have emotional commitments against. They hate and attack godly principles. Antagonistic. They do reverse evangelism. Make sure that you're not prioritizing the feelings of the evil over the needs of the wise families in your church. Make sure you're not doing that. So what we want to do is we want to preach to instruct the wise, correct the foolish, and I'm going to say something that may have a bit of an edge to it. Drive out the evil. We want to, like, you really do. If there are, and so just, hey, if you're a pastor, maybe let's view things through the lens of the book of Jude and through the lens of Jesus. Hey, dude, there's like literal wolves are a real thing. And it's very interesting. Jesus does not say, watch out for wolves in shepherd's clothing, although shepherds can be wolves. He said, watch out for wolves in sheep's clothing. In other words, you're actually going to have more wolves among the members. And so, hey, dude, you got to watch out for that. Don't work really, really hard to keep people who hate godly principles and the purposes of God. Don't work really hard to keep them, because very frankly, it's going to take a supernatural act of God to win them, and only the truth can set them free. Josh, I've got to shut us down, man. This was an absolute blast. I love you, man. I love you.
I love you too. I'm grateful for your courage, your boldness, and I've told you this before, but you really have a gift, bro, in articulating complex things in very simple ways, and I really am grateful for you and for Lake Point, the whole staff there. It's a sweet move of God, and it's fun to be part of from a distance.
That's very mutual, man. We love you.
Yeah, love you too, buddy.
Peace.
See ya.